What's on your radar, Batya?
I'm afraid you're not going to like this one, Ravi. The World Trade Organization has ruled that the U.S. violated international trade rules with tariffs imposed by the Trump administration on imported steel and aluminum in 2018. The tariffs had been a major Trump campaign promise in 2016, and in March of 2018, Trump imposed a 25% tariff on steel and a 10% tariff on aluminum, invoking an obscure Cold War-era law called Section 232 that allows presidents to curb imports deemed a threat to national security as justification. Trump argued that it was in our national security to, quote, protect domestic manufacturers from global overproduction of the metals, the Wall Street Journal reported. China brought an immediate complaint about the tariffs to the WTO, requesting the tariffs be disputed. And on Friday, the WTO ruled in China's favor, finding the tariffs unjustified because, quote, the measures were not taken in time of war or other emergency in international relations. Though these were Trump-era tariffs, the Biden administration's response to this Friday ruling has been pretty based. Effectively, they told the WTO to cry more, lib. Quote, the Biden administration is committed to preserving U.S. national security by ensuring the long-term viability of our steel and aluminum industries. We do not intend to remove the Section 232 duties as a result of these disputes, Adam Hodge, spokesman for the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, said in a statement. The WTO dispute settlement process, quote, has no authority to review national security issues, Hodge insisted. Like I said, based. The response to the WTO proves once again that President Biden continues to be the most left-wing president since, well, Donald Trump. Trump is not historically known as a leftist, but when it came to the U.S. economy, his populist, protectionist agenda was the stuff of Bernie Sanders' dreams. From dismantling NAFTA to policing the border to starting a trade war with China, Trump's economic policies were the kinds of things Democrats used to push because they protect America's working class. If economic elites tend to see the economy in terms of trade, for workers, the economy is really all about jobs. And in that dichotomy, it's clear what side Trump was on. Trump's tariffs and anti-trade agenda dismayed the free marketeers who had the Republican Party prior to Trump. Indeed, his agenda should have delighted leftists if they could have seen past their loathing of Trump the man. Of course, Trump remains determined to prove them right, most recently suggesting we get rid of the Constitution and breaking bread with known anti-Semites and white nationalists. But while Trump may be politically finished, his pro-worker populism lives on. Last week, 6 of the highest-profile Republican senators, including Senator Marco Rubio, Josh Hawley, Ted Cruz, and Lindsey Graham, joined Democrats to demand 7 days paid sick leave for railroad workers. The effort failed, but the statement was loud and clear. The divide over economic populism is alive and well in the GOP. The issue could not be more relevant. Companies are on pace to reshore 350,000 jobs this year, according to an August report. Investment in good working-class jobs that provide good middle-class wages should be a top priority for both parties. And steel falls squarely in that field. Though steel manufacturing has steadily declined, the industry still employs over 130,000 people, 79,000 of whom work in steel mills, thanks to the fact that between 70 and 90% of our steel consumption in the U.S. is supplied by domestic mills. And these workers are well paid. The average steel mill worker's annual wages were $88,000 a year in 2020. It's exactly the kind of industry the government should be deeply concerned with protecting. Of course, even in the U.S., there's competition between unionized integrated mills and what are called mini mills, which operate more cheaply. But according to Congressional Research Service, regular tariffs have kept the rate at which steel is imported relatively stable, which has been a boon for the domestic industry. Meanwhile, the Biden administration already negotiated agreements with Europeans to bring a certain amount of steel into the country without duties, and South Korea agreed to a self-imposed export quota. Free market types like to point out that trade is good for overall GDP, and of course they're right. Trade in the aggregate raises GDP. But we do not live in the aggregate, and there is a clear and obvious tension between the consumer of goods and services and their producer. The consumer wants a cheap product while the producer wants a fair wage. This tension tended to be more or less evened out when our economy's biggest sector was manufacturing and production, because workers were making things that they themselves consumed: homes, cars, steaks. But today, the biggest sector of our economy is finance, and CEOs are not investing back in workers, but in things like stock buybacks. Production has been offshored. Now, Chinese slaves make cheap products for American consumers, while the American working class struggles with opioid addiction, suicide, and alcoholism, which are typically known as deaths of despair. Free trade marketeers like to talk about competitive advantage, but what if China's competitive advantage is that it's willing to employ Uyghur slave labor? Not really consistent with a free market, is it? I don't think there's much dispute that the benefits of our national trade deals over the last 30 years have gone to the top of the income distribution, while the working class has paid for it with their jobs, stable communities, dignities, and even their lives. Economists have found again and again that free trade and the opioid crisis feed each other. One study found that for every 1,000 people who lost their jobs in a county, there was a 2.7% rise in opioid-related overdose deaths. And once fentanyl entered the market, the same 1,000 trade-related job losses led to an 11.3% spike in overdose deaths. A Yale study from 2020 found the same thing. Areas exposed negatively to international trade policy experienced an increase in fatal drug overdoses, specifically in the white population. The lesson could not be clearer. You cannot consume your way into the middle class. So excuse me when I agree with the Biden administration that the World Trade Organization can take its ruling about what is and what is not a national security threat and shove it. Of course, trade is crucial to national security. It's something our founding father, Alexander Hamilton, believed and strongly advocated for. Contrary to the prevailing worldview of his day, Hamilton opposed the idea of national specialization with a focus on free trade. Hamilton believed that political independence and economic self-sufficiency were inextricably connected. And for the U.S. to be economically self-sufficient, it needed to be able to rely on domestic manufacturing and farming. As Matthew C. Klein and Michael Pettis explain in their brilliant book, Trade Wars or Class Wars, Hamilton recommended raising taxes on foreign manufacturing and using the money to support American producers. Government intervention would make American-made goods cheap relative to imports from Europe, encouraging Americans to buy locally, write Klein and Pettis. What we have today is the exact opposite. Elites across the world use trade to protect their own interests, while workers can't afford to buy what they make, or they lose their jobs altogether, write Klein and Pettis. What looks like economic competition between the U.S. and China is actually a class war being waged within each country by economic elites against the working class. As Hamilton accurately noted, economic self-sufficiency and political independence are deeply connected. The demise of the American working class through international trade agreements may not have been an intentional ploy to give elites more political power, but that has certainly been its impact. Good on the Biden administration for telling the WTO how little their finding in favor of China means to us. We have workers to protect. All right, Robbie.
Oh, we are going to fight, Batya. You're right. I had no idea what you were going to throw at me when you, because we're often so in sync, and we talk about a lot of issues that we're similarly disposed to. So when you said I was going to hate this radar, I didn't know what you were going to throw at me. You're right, I do. So what about all the industries? Even taking your point that we want to protect American workers, we want to protect jobs. What about all the domestic industries that are not primarily steel industries, but rely on steel as a product? If steel is more expensive for them, if maybe it's a component of whatever their product is, well, then don't, because they have to spend more money buying steel because we've artificially protected the steel industry. Don't they end up just laying off people in there? They have to spend more money buying raw materials, so they raise prices, and that's worse for everyone. And then they have to lay off more people or something like that. And also, doesn't then the domestic steel industry, if they're just reaping more profits because we've artificially made the price of our steel higher, don't they? Again, wouldn't this be the same from your logic that, this is all going to be captured by the elites and the owners, et cetera? Don't they just profit more of that, and so they don't pass that on to their own workers, do they?
Right. So I think the key here is what you mean by artificially. What happened, my understanding is, I'm no economist, okay? I'm just like a normie trying to understand this stuff. But my understanding is that we have consistently had tariffs on steel on and off for the last 50 years. And so rather than artificially limiting international trade and imports of steel, we never artificially allowed imports from steel to go to compete in the marketplace. And so the people who consume steel in America America, of course they're paying more than if they were consuming steel from China. But it never happened that the marketplace regulated itself or got used to that lower price, because we have always protected more or less, on and off this industry. And so to me, the question is, it's not like NAFTA was some sort of like government non-intervention. NAFTA was the government intervening and putting its finger on the scale by allowing a certain kind of trade that we have long understood is not in our national interest. And I'll just make one more point. In their book, Class Wars Are Trade Wars, Trade Wars Are Class Wars, Pettis and Klein make a really interesting argument. They argue that the dollar is actually too strong, that what happens is in a place like China, because the consumers, the producers, the workers they cannot afford to produce what they're making. The elites have this problem where they can't invest in China itself, and so they invest in America. America is actually the place where China and Germany invest most of, there's just a lot of international financial investment here. And they argue that is actually screwing over American workers, because American workers simply are too expensive relative to the slaves in China. And that's what I'm talking about when I say, like, okay, I know that you're thinking, well, competitive advantage. But if the competitive advantage is that they have no civil rights and they're literally employing slaves, is that really something we want our market to be taking advantage of? I don't think so.
Well, slavery is bad. I think that's an uncontroversial point here. But the problem with it, right, from my point of view, is the slavery is not the cheaper steel price. I mean, if they want to say this is refusing to take or doing this policy is going to have some positive effect on the human rights condition in China, then fine, we could have, I guess, that public policy debate. We could say we have to do this because this helps Chinese human rights. I don't know that that's actually going to work I don't know that we'll actually have any influence over that policy, which would make me then not want to, raise steel prices for our. In some way, that's asking Americans, I think, to sacrifice out of some naive hope that we can improve a foreign country, which is the kind of bad thinking of our entire Ukraine-Russia policy right now.
Oh, yeah, I totally agree with that. I guess more what I meant to say was that, in the Hamilton model anyway, you take the money you make off the tariffs and you reinvest that back in the places that need help, either paying American workers, so either the industry, the mills themselves, or people who want to buy American, right? You give them some sort of tax credit or something like that to lubricate that, to make it so that everybody is benefiting from that, because you've, of course, made this money off of these tariffs.
All right, well, 2 takes on the news of the day, and we'll have more Rising right after this.